Welcome to the channel, everybody. Welcome to ESPN Esports. I am Jacob Wolf. You have seen me on many of your shows, and my lovely co-host Emily Rand of the Riff Rewind, the Valorant show, the LPL show, which is later tonight, all the other things that happen on this channel that she is featured in. And we have a very special guest for you today, in Genie Doi, who is one of the top immigration lawyers in all of esports. Genie works with many of the LCS teams you're probably familiar with on their immigration for foreign players coming into the United States and competing in the LCS. And given the fact that the League of Legends World Championship is in a very abnormal circumstance this year, it will be in a bubble in Shanghai starting at the end of September all the way through October. And the fact that the world is being hit very hard by COVID-19, both here in the United States and other countries that participate in the World Championship, such as Brazil and others. I wanted to invite Jeannie on to come talk to us and tell us a little bit more about some of these circumstances. You all may have seen our reporting around SK Gaming's trick and what's going on with him and him being ruled worlds ineligible. Jeannie is not able to talk to specific teams or players, given that she represents some of them in some cases. So we'll keep that from, but we do want to have a wide sweeping conversation about sort of the status of immigration and visas in abnormal circumstances, to subscribe it at the very bare minimum. So, Jeannie, how are you doing?
Good, good. Thanks for having me on. Super excited to talk to you guys about these issues.
Thank
Nice.
you. Yeah, we appreciate you taking the time to join us. So I want to start off here, just kind of broadly. You've been doing immigration work throughout all of this year, in the midst of COVID. Obviously, there are not a lot of first-time visa applicants in the middle of this because it's been so difficult. But what have you noticed from this year? How immigration has been different? Immigration work has been different from previous years, given everything going on.
So, immigration traditionally it follows a very standard procedure. The first step, it's called a petition. I like to think of that as like an invitation to the party. If your petition gets approved, you get an invitation to come join the USA party. Then the second step is to go to a visa interview overseas, and I like to call that the wristband. So if you pass the interview, you get your wristband, and you actually get to go through the doors. You got the invitation, but you get to get into the doors of the club. So that's the traditional process. There's a set timeline. There's a set, costs that teams are comfortable with. But what's been different this year with COVID is that basically every month since January, there have been these presidential proclamations that have been altering that very routine process that we're all accustomed to, whether it's banning China and then banning half of Europe and then banning Iran or banning, visas from Brazil now. Um, it um, it's really unpredictable and it's all tied to the pandemic. So if the pandemic gets really bad in a certain country, just for example, like Australia, they might start banning people from Australia from coming to the United States. And so there's really no way for me to predict what countries are going to be banned next or when bans are going to be lifted, which is why I feel so bad for all the GMs out there who are just struggling with anxiety, just not they can't even plan contingency plans for their contingency plans because nobody knows what's going to happen next.
I think one of the main questions I had in regards to so there's two things. I'll start with the first one. What does this mean for like what has this meant for players on existing visas, specifically in the United States, but if you can comment in Europe at all? And then how difficult has it been for them? Like, say they're already here, they've been playing on a North American team for a really long time, like for years. Does that still like help them in any way, or are they still having issues with visa renewal?
That's a great question. So if a player is already here in the United States, I can extend their visa without them having to leave the country. So they can
Mm,
stay
Mm.
put, they can keep their visa, they can stay on, it's not an issue. But big problem arises is when they need to leave the country, for example, for
mm.
Worlds. Once you travel overseas, you can't get back into the United States until you go to that visa interview. And right now, nobody's doing visa interviews because of COVID-19.
Mm.
Okay. And then my second part to that, which you kind of already answered, but traveling to China specifically, I know as someone who, and I'm sure Jacob is already also familiar, we've both applied for journalism visas to China. My process was that I had to, get a letter from basically the LPL to sponsor me and then apply for a visa interview, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't end up going on that trip, but it was already a really lengthy process. With the like quarantine restrictions, et cetera, like how much more difficult is it for players who are already, especially here on foreign visas, to apply to China for this world championship?
Actually, China, because of COVID-19, they had actually banned any foreigners from coming into Chinese borders. And then they also canceled all visa applications, visa interviews because of the virus. They were actually only reopened like 3 days ago. And so,
Mm.
and they were only reopened to European countries and to South Korea. And so the routine visa process was actually not even available until 3 years ago. But now that the virus situation is kind of getting under control, they've reopened it. But my understanding is, Tencent plays a big part in
Hmm.
putting on worlds. And so Tencent is almighty in China. If they tell the government, hey, we need visas for these, teams who are located in Europe or located in the United States, I think the Chinese government is going to accommodate. But the issue arises frequently with Korean players who, for military reasons, are only given very short, limited passports. And
Hmm.
so when you apply for a visa with China or any other country in the world, they often ask for at least 6 months left on your passport. So they want to make sure that your passport is valid for 6 months beyond like today's date. But for Korean players, they're only given 1 year visas. And so many times they don't have that 6 months left, right? Like right now, we're in August. Maybe they only have 4 months left on their passport. So they can't even make an application to the Chinese government because their passport is not valid for a long enough duration.
And that's exactly what happened to Trick in a very short notice, based off our reporting that we talked about earlier this week, and I'm sure it's going to be an issue too for many of these others. Jeannie, I do want to ask, that something I was on, or I was able to overhear a call that Riot Games had a few weeks ago, around Neom, but it was not. And something that was mentioned in that same call was the fact, the discussion came up about why does Riot Games need to work with governments? And Nico Laurent, the CEO of Riot, said that part of the reason they're able to put on Worlds this year is because they have a good relationship with the Chinese government, and a fleshed out relationship with the Chinese government. I wanted to ask, in terms of governments, sort of leeway to athletes and everything else, in your previous research, historically, what's happened in hundreds of years of immigration around the world, have you seen governments be a little bit more lenient towards like high profile athletes of any kind? And do you think that esports or players sort of meet that merit to potentially get a little bit more leeway in China than a random person wanting to go visit?
Yeah, absolutely. Governments are, not immune to nepotism, or if you name drop, or if you're a global celebrity, like they're going to make exceptions for you, right? Specifically when it comes to having to work with governments, the reason why, team organizations or league organizers have to work with governments is to get the proper approvals, permits to hold these major events or, obtain visas for these events. I was actually really surprised when I heard that Worlds is going to go on because my understanding was that China had canceled all sporting events for the
Hmm.
rest of the calendar year due to COVID. And so I was really, concerned that, well, okay, I guess that takes Worlds off the table. Like Worlds is very clearly a sporting event. Um, but Worlds is happening, and it's because
Hmm.
Riot somehow got the Chinese government to say, well, World, League of Legends is not sports. So I think that's how they did it.
So I want to one thing I do want to return to, because it was so prominent in the Trick, like the recent thing with Trick and the trouble with his passport renewal. And I know it's something that a lot of South Korean players in North America worry about really frequently. when they're over here, especially if they want to become a resident, like not a resident in the sense, maybe they also want to become a resident in the sense of being a resident of the US, but they want to get residency in terms of Riot recognizes them as an NA player as opposed to an LCK player. How much does, like, if you could give, because I feel like this is something that Western viewers don't necessarily remember or understand, like if you could give an overview of just how much mandatory Korean military service does affect visas and passports and the longevity of how long you can stay, in another country.
Sure. So for those of you guys who don't know, Korean men are required to serve around 2 years of compulsory military service between the ages of when they're 20 to 27 is usually when they're required to go. And you can choose when you go. You can either say, you know what, I'm 20 years old, I'm going to take a leave of absence from college and, just get it out of the way. Or you can say, you know what, I really want to finish what I'm doing right now. And you can defer for a number of reasons up to 5 times between the ages of 20 and 27. Reasons for deferment might be you're in school, you're in university, or you're finishing your high school or something like that. Maybe you've had a baby and you want to be there for the first year of the baby's life. Working overseas is a big one. Obviously, like if you've got a job overseas, you can't simultaneously serve in the military. But again, you're only allowed to defer 5 times. Once you've hit that fifth time, you get basically a draft notice, and it actually comes by text by Kakao Talk, and they tell you, all right, it's time to show up, report for duty. And unless you have some extremely extenuating circumstances, if you don't show up, um, you can be charged with a crime, right? You're trying to evade the draft. And there's actually a very famous story, like maybe 20 years ago. There's this big K-pop star who was pursuing like a singing and acting career in the United States, and he was basically accused of avoiding the draft. And his punishment by the Korean government was he can no longer step foot on Korean soil for the rest of his life. And for Koreans, and I'm Korean American, like for Koreans, like that hurts. Like that's a big deal. Like we're even though, I was born and raised in the United States, like I have a like Koreans are just very closely tied to our homeland.
Mhm.
And so being told like you can't come to your country anymore, you can't see your relatives anymore, it really does something to your identity, to your mentality. um, and I think also for men, it's not for the players here, they're not trying to avoid the military.
Mhm.
They want to do their duty, but it's just that they don't want to do it now at the peak of their career. They know that, right now they're at the top of their game. If they go away for 2 years and during those 2 years they're not allowed to touch a video game, their career's over,
Mhm.
Yeah.
and why, to sacrifice that, it's a really difficult decision.
Yeah, I think we've only seen, at least in recent mind, one player have go in and come out on the other side, still being able to do something. But he actually switched games, and that's Pult,
Mm.
who was a
Mhm.
StarCraft 2 pro before
Mm.
he went into military service, and now he's a TFT content creator, and that's his. He's a high level TFT player in South Korea. I want to ask on that note. We have seen, it's funny you mentioned a K-pop star because we have seen people like BTS and other K-pop stars get a permanent deferral, very high level permanent deferral. We haven't seen that happen, at
Mhm.
least as I'm aware, with an esports player. There's been a lot of discussion of whether Faker meets that criteria and if they'd forcibly draft him. And obviously, if they didn't win the Asian Games, otherwise he would have gotten that permanent deferral by nature of being an Olympic athlete or in the Olympic circuit.
Mhm.
I mean, do you think that like based off sort of your read on the situation that there's a world where like esports players kind of meet that criteria of pro athlete or music or acting star that they can get permanent deferrals more frequently, or do you think for the time being in the foreseeable future we're gonna just see all of our favorite esports pros go away around age 25?
Sure. So I'm glad that you bring up the point of permanent deferral. So there are few criteria where you can qualify for permanent deferral, and that's like if you're an Olympic athlete or you're a major global sensation like BTS. Um, I would say based on those criteria, Faker's probably the best you're going to get. If Faker
Hmm.
can't get a permanent deferral, I don't know who can, right? Like you've got to be legendary. You've got your name has to be worldwide under, known across the globe. But I think even though as prevalent as esports is in South Korea, it's still a subculture, right? And so because it's not in the mainstream, I think it's going to be harder for the government officials who are in power to look kindly on someone like Faker as, prominent as he is. They're not going to understand how he compares with a group like BTS.
In considering like applying for a Chinese visa, if you are an older player and you haven't served your military service, is it better to have played in Korea, for example? Like if you've been playing in LCK for all of your life and you're like 25, 26 and you want to go to this year's Worlds, um as opposed to a player who's been playing like in NA or EU like Trick, because I was wondering, like, obviously being on a foreign visa complicates things, but also there are some rumors that the Korean government would be a little bit more lenient if you've actually been in South Korea the entire time, as opposed to being in the US or being in Europe. Is there any truth to that, or is that just kind of like an assumption that people might be making?
There's like no truth to that. Like that's a
Okay.
total assumption. It's actually easier for the Korean military, for the Korean government to draft you if you're physically in Korea, right? So they can literally like knock on your
Show up at
door
your
and
house, yeah.
say, "Yeah,
Yeah.
you're coming with us."
Like, hey, what's
But
up?
yeah, but if you're over here at like Alienware training facility, like they have no jurisdiction to come get you. Like Kakao Talk doesn't work. They can't notify
Yeah.
you to even show up to
Unless
their
they're gonna
house.
like put you on an Interpol list, but that's I mean that's a whole
Yeah.
nother level of tier, right? Like if they're gonna
Right.
make you
They're
internationally
if they're
wanted
not going
criminal.
to defer visas for esports players, they're not going to put them on an
Right,
Interpol list
right.
either.
So
Yeah, I was wondering that because of Faker, actually, because a lot of people have been speculating whether Faker would be able to get a visa, because he is getting, like, I say old, like not really old, but old in terms of he hasn't served his military service yet.
So I wanted to ask about the process of doing, given how tight travel restrictions are generally, right, and how difficult and even intimidating, even if it's not restricted, it's like scary to hop on a plane, right, for a lot of people right now. From a embassy perspective, if you are a player who has one of your deferrals like lined up, you can still do it. And you're not going to hit that wall of five. Are you able to like walk into a South Korean embassy in New York or LA or wherever you may be and like actually do that process there, or do you actually have to go back home?
No, you can absolutely renew your passport at, the Korean embassy in here in K-Town or
Hmm.
in New York, wherever in the United States. They're a foreign embassy, like their job is to help their citizens in a foreign country, and part of helping their citizens is, getting their documentation in order. So they're going to renew your passport, but they might tell you like, oh, we noticed that you're 25 years old, you haven't served your military yet, your travel permit, like your permission to be living and working overseas, that's actually coming up, and so please don't forget to go home and serve your duty. I haven't had a client thus far get turned away, or I haven't had anyone go through an experience saying, sorry, we're not going to renew your passport because you haven't done your military service.
Hmm.
All of each time they've been quite accommodating here in LA, but I can't speak for like New York or other consulates.
And are there short-term extensions possible? Say like you do have that 4 months left, right? If end of 2020, and then you got to figure out what you got to do. Do you think that the Korean embassy would be willing to say, oh, here's an additional two for you to meet that additional 2 months for you to meet the 6 month requirement to apply for China? Or is it 1 year or bust?
They'll actually give you an emergency passport, so they might give you
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
a one-time use 2 month or 6 month passport.
Gotcha. Gotcha. That is interesting.
So I'm an esports team, and I haven't prepared, and I just found out I'm going to Worlds. What do you do? Like, how can you help me with like the narrow time window? And I mean, you can't say whether teams have prepared yet, but if you are a team, should you have already started preparing regardless of whether you know you're going to be attending or not?
Absolutely. And at least all of the teams that I've been working with, they've been preparing since last month. Even
Nice.
though, playoffs weren't, determined, they didn't know, whether they were going or not. To this day, they don't know whether they're going to Worlds or not. They're still ready. They're still all operating under the assumption that we're going to go, if we make it. So everyone is ready. The only issues are that, some people have had passport issues that, like we've talked about. Another issue is COVID. So in order to get a
Mhm.
Chinese visa, when you go apply to get a Chinese visa, you need to present a negative COVID test. And
Mhm.
then even if at the time you apply for your visa, you have a negative COVID test, 48 hours before you board the plane, you need to again present a negative COVID test. And so between now and 2 hours before, or 2 days before your flight, if you contract COVID, you're not getting on that plane
Done.
and you're
Yeah.
not going to
Mhm.
Worlds. So it is extremely important for players to isolate. Don't have your girlfriend over. Don't, just really be careful, because if you contract the virus, you've just, even if you have a Chinese visa, even if you don't have military issues, you're not going.
And so how do we, or I guess, or when you look at like how the Chinese government is handling this, do you think they're going to be more discriminatory towards countries where COVID is such a massive problem, like the United States, Brazil, et cetera, where the outbreak is much higher than it is in places like Europe right now and South Korea?
I don't think so. Granted, like the United States is probably the worst country in the world when it comes to
Mhm.
COVID right now, and if they're issuing visas to Americans, I think that we've set the bar kind of low. So I don't think it's going to be an
It's
issue.
so true. Sorry, I couldn't
Um,
help laugh.
yeah,
Oh, it's
but
so true.
what I am concerned about, and a question that you guys haven't asked me yet, is, so let's say the teams have got their visas to China. Let's say they're negative with their COVID. Um, how do they get back after Worlds, right?
Mm.
Because remember, there is still a travel ban on anyone who has been in China within the last 14 days, cannot step foot in the United States. And so what does that mean for our players, right? Like, let's say you're a Canadian, you have a Chinese visa, you went to China, you've been there for 3 weeks, you want to come back, can't come back to LA because you've been in China. So what do? Right? Um, Luckily for most of the players, everyone can go back to their home country. Like that Canadian can go back to Canada, hang out at home for 14 days and then come back to LA, because Canada is not on the travel ban list. But let's say you've got someone who's Danish. After Worlds, they fly from Shanghai to Denmark. Denmark is on a travel ban list. And so even if he hangs out in Denmark for 14 days, he's not going to be able to catch a direct flight from Denmark to LA unless he gets what's called a national interest exception, which is something very new. They just announced it like a couple days ago, where you basically make an application to the US Embassy, by in your home country, and say it is in the national interest of the United States to allow me to get on a plane and fly directly to the United States.
That seems
W-
pretty. That seems like for
Yeah.
diplomats, not esports players.
Yeah, I was gonna
I've done
say.
it though. I've done it.
Have you?
So yeah. So we've been successful, with a Dane, with someone from Norway. Have not been successful in Australia, unfortunately. So what's annoying is that it's very case by case. Each
Mm.
country is handling it differently. Each officer is handling it differently. So whereas I think the Scandinavian countries, it was really easy for me to make the argument and say like, hey, esports is a multi-billion-dollar industry. If this player can't get his butt back to LA, he's going to lose his contract. Um, the United States is going to lose that payroll. They're going to lose that income tax. The American workers who serve this person, they're going to be out of work. this player is going to cancel his lease agreement, his landlord is going to lose money.
Mm.
So I just kind of extrapolated and made this an economic issue, and that seemed to do the trick, but it didn't work in Australia for whatever reason. So it's just really case by case.
So
Hmm.
I guess we could say if you are an American player trying to get back from China, you may go enjoy your South Korean vacation for the 14 days after. Can you do that? Like in theory, could you like go to a different country and like take time
Uh,
off post Worlds and then like try to come back from there?
okay.
Because they're a
So
distant.
Americans, if an American's been in China, America will take back its own citizens. So if you're an American, you will be able to come back to the United States. But to answer your question about like getting to kind of trying to bypass by traveling to what we call a third country and then going from the third country to the United States, it's possible, but I would not count on it. A really popular option right now is to hang out in Croatia for 14 days and have this like beautiful Croatian vacation, ride out your quarantine there, and then catch a flight from Croatia to JFK and then find your way back to whatever city you're destined to in the United States. Um, but the problem is like let's say you have a layover in London or you have a layover, in France. That layover counts as you having been in one of the travel ban countries. And so
Great.
the airlines,
Mm.
yeah, the airlines are going to know that. And they basically, if you have a European passport, you're basically put on something called a do not board list. And so airlines will not let you get on the plane if they know if you don't have that national interest exception.
Wow.
It's
So
pretty stringent. Yeah.
yeah, I was gonna say it's sounding like the main issue isn't even necessarily going to be like. Obviously, I think we will see some visas denied for European and any teams, but it sounds like the real issue is going to be for 2021 when GMs are looking at their teams and thinking, either A, are we even going to be able to like get these players that we want to the US, and B, like, yeah, how does that affect like our roster
Mhm.
building, or what we want to do, or the players that we want to keep on our team?
Sure. I would argue that we've already kind of seen that between spring and summer.
Hmm.
There weren't as many major roster moves as we're used to seeing.
Yep.
And I think it is most definitely going to affect roster moves, in November, um, if the US embassies are still closed. And fortunately, we do have this vehicle called the national interest exception to say, hey, like this person is a really big deal. It is in the national interest of the United States that they come here and please give us a visa interview. But because those are simply not guaranteed, GMs are going to manage their risk, right? They're not going to
Hmm.
take
Right.
that undue risk. So one piece of advice I have for GMs is look to Canada. um, Canadians are a special class of people. Um, Not only are they extremely nice people, they actually don't need to attend visa interviews. So basically,
Mm.
if you have an approved petition, you just have that invitation, they can get on a plane and come straight to the United States. All Canadians are exempt from that visa interview process. And so it's going to be a lot easier to import Canadians than anyone else.
Okay. Well, Jacob, looks like your off season is going to be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it adds a sort of a new layer to it. I do want to ask though, in that regard, we have seen, and I believe some of your colleagues did work on this. We have seen the occasional player get a permanent resident green card, or in some cases actually apply to become an American citizen. I believe Jensen was one of those that comes to mind that he got a green card, if I remember right. Quas, I remember, was one of those people that fell under that exception too many years ago with Liquid and Curse. Um, do you think now there's some sort of an urgency, like if your career is here and the entire time you've been on a visa, is now there's some urgency for you to actually apply to be a permanent resident and make your life in the United States a permanent thing?
Sure. So speaking for Korean clients, As I mentioned, Koreans just have very strong ties to the motherland. Most of them don't actually want to live here permanently. Like most of them,
Mhm.
they have to go back to Korea. Like every off season, they need the Korean food. They need just to be in at home. So I think even though a lot of Korean players are interested in pursuing green cards, it's not because they want to make a life here. It's simply to get that permanent deferral for military service, right? Because if you have a green card prior to hitting, prior to, if you get a green card in the year that you turn 27 years old, you are able to defer your military service indefinitely. And remember, Koreans count age a little bit differently.
Mhm.
So, Koreans, we consider when you're born, you're actually a 1 year old because the 9 months in utero, like we round up and we call that one. So, technically, in US years, the year that a player turns 26, if they don't have a green card, they're not going to be able to defer their military service any longer unless there's some extremely extenuating circumstance.
Hmm. Interesting. So when you look at sort of the state of the world, I don't want to ask you to be like God and try to predict how COVID-19 will shake, but in terms of things improving, we certainly have seen Europe get better in many regards. Some countries are in the toilet still too, but um, also but we do see a lot of the Western Hemisphere, in particular South America and North America, have really terrible COVID situations. How do you think this will impact immigration just generally moving forward? Like, do you think this has lasting circumstances even when we're out of the thick of it?
Yes, I think the Trump administration has done so much damage to the immigration infrastructure that like there's going to be lasting consequences. So a very clear
Mhm.
example is international students who used to, America used to be like the place to get your master's degree or your PhD. They see on the news how immigrants are treated in this country, how the visa nightmare, how the getting a visa is an absolute nightmare. And they're all going to Canada now, or they're all going to the UK now. They'd rather study at Oxford instead of Harvard. And those students, once they're done with their education, would normally enter the United States workforce, be a doctor, be a professor, be a scientist or an engineer here. But they're not going to come here 2 to 4 years down the road when they're done with their degree. They're going to stay in Canada or they're going to stay in the UK or maybe go back to their home country. So that is definitely happening in the short term, and as it applies to esports. Um, I'm if COVID gets better, and this is an and. So if COVID gets better and there's a change in presidential regime at the end of the year, then I think the visa situation is going to make a 180. It's going to take time to trickle down. So even when the Trump administration came into office in 2017, it took about a year before those theoretical kind of policies actually trickled down to my desk and started affecting my clients. And so even if a Democrat is elected in November, that Democrat doesn't take office until the end of January, and whatever policies they want to undo, it's going to take, at minimum a year for all those anti-immigrant or difficult visa policies to be unraveled. So I think 2021 is still going to be a rough year for immigration, but I'm really hoping 2022 is when we're going to get a little bit of relief.
Well, Jeannie, we really appreciate you joining us for this a little bit more than half-hour
Mhm.
discussion. It was super insightful. I'm sure we will see more from you. Worth the follow, by the way, at Pure Genie US on Twitter. I follow Jeannie and keep up with. You're good about sharing not just esports related immigration stuff, but all the other like global politics and everything
Mhm.
else that goes into it. So definitely worth keeping up with you on Twitter. But we really appreciate you joining us. Definitely, Emily and I will have more coverage of this type of stuff in the coming months because we do anticipate it will affect the World Championship in a pretty big way. So you can find all of our content at espn.com/esports and youtube.com/espn esports.
Thanks for having me. Bye, everyone.